Direct strike of potentially catastrophic and life-threatening hurricane expected late tonight and early Monday.
Of course, we lost power. The storm starts hitting, and it is intense.
Two of our people we almost lost. It was trying.
The shit's about to hit the fan.
Hadn't thought about this in a while.
We're facing something catastrophic.
I'll take a minute.
We're actually called the Crescent City, and the reason why we're called the Crescent City is because the original city was in the shape of a crescent in the downtown French Quarter type area. That was where the city was originally settled because it was above water. It was above the sea level because over years and years and years of the Mississippi River overtopping its levees right there, it deposited a lot of silt, soil, and actually built up that area. The city eventually built canals to drain the swampland, and that's why most of us live under sea level. So you'll have canals, and they pump water out of the city into the canals, and those canals drain into the lake. And that was one of the failures during Katrina, was the pumps went out and we had some levee failures of those drainage canals. We couldn't pump out the water, so the water just collected, and that's why we had so much water in the city.
Friday night, we knew there was a storm in the Gulf. We weren't too concerned about it because it wasn't supposed to be coming towards New Orleans or Louisiana.
The weekend before Katrina hit, it was actually EMS Expo.
Come Friday night, we all went out. They had the big EMS party.
Everybody's having a good time and just partying, drinking, just celebrating the whole week. And this little guy comes running up and he's looking at the weather and he said, "Hey, this hurricane has turned and is coming towards New Orleans."
Well, as usual, here in New Orleans, we always have hurricane scares. And leading up to Katrina, we figured it was just going to be another hurricane, and it got a little more intense.
Before you know it, 12 hours, less hours, and then you knew for sure it was coming straight here.
It was interesting because we all knew this was a big storm, more so than we've dealt with before. We've always dealt with like category 1s, some 2s, never anything bigger than that. And a lot of us had already been through a number of storms, through evacuations and all that, so we kind of knew what to expect. But there was a little bit of uneasiness because we weren't exactly sure, because this one was a bit different.
Mark comes in onto the floor of the ambulance bay, and he says, "All right, everybody gather around." And the speech that he gave us was probably the big wake-up call. He told us that it was going to get really bad and that we would probably lose communications at a certain point, and that we would have to act on our own without any direction from our leadership. And then he did something really strange. He asked us to all hold hands, and he said a prayer.
That was a little different. Normally we just worked through and we were fine. But that was a little different. Gave us an indication that something serious was coming.
That was the last time we would ever be in that bay at those headquarters together.
After that, They paired us up with our partners, and they sent us out to these different areas across the city.
We had a crew at Children's Hospital, we had a crew at LSU Dental, we had a crew on the West Bank. Our goal was to be available to all different areas of the city.
So from Moss Street, we took the rescue truck, a sprint car, and a couple of ambulances over to the Crescent City Connection Police Headquarters over on the West Bank.
We were watching the overflow on the side where our trucks were parked to make checks. I think the sprint car we had at the time, we saw that the window got blown out on the back just from flying debris.
We were able to see, the wind and the rain action, the light poles just swaying back and forth. We saw debris coming through the parking lot area and busting out windows in some of the police vehicles and some of our vehicles.
All these buildings were just riddled like Swiss cheese. The windows were just broken out of them. You had window shades, levelers just hanging out, blown in the wind.
It was pretty intense watching the storm make landfall and actually, hit the area where we were at.
It just looked like a disaster scene from a movie, it was crazy.
As I recall looking out police headquarters window, seeing a gentleman noticing that there was some water around his ankles. I didn't really think much about it, and then it seemed like it was rising, but we got word from the police department that the levees had broken.
When you see water, it becomes a devastating component. The secondary piece was we had to go into survival mode.
Vividly remember trying to help a woman change her oxygen tank, and I couldn't get her to understand how to do it, and her phone went dead. Listening to the calls, including from off-duty police officers calling, saying that they were in their attics and the water was rising, and telling them to, punch holes in the roof, shoot holes in the roof, get on something high, can you see a window? And hearing mothers saying, look, I've got floaties on my kids, and then the line would go dead and you knew they drowned.
I want to say New Orleans East flooded before the rest of the city did. Levees on the canals over top, and we flooded quick.
It was just water everywhere, and we had lost all communications at that point, so we had no idea what's going on.
At one point, our supervisor, Cliff, was able to get radio communications with some of our people in the city, and they basically said, you're on your own.
Me and my group, we were at the dental school not far from Moss Street.
We all were kind of looking out a window on one of the upper floors. I think we're on the 3rd or 4th floor, and you could just see water creeping in.
The water came up to my knees within 30 minutes.
We realized that, we were going to be trapped there.
We were now then starting to match up with NOFD because we saw the flooding. The next assessment was for us to go do boat rescue. So my team then was the first to engage on those as well.
So we loaded up our ambulances with people that were saved out of the water, and none of them had medical complaints, but they needed a place to go. So we loaded up our ambulances and we head to the Superdome.
Later on, maybe the next day or so, Cliff was able to use one of the radios and get in communication with Cedric Polzano. He had just gotten out of the Army National Guard on a dust-off unit, and he had gotten hold of them. They were doing dust-offs, and he said, hey, I got people out in the east. Is it possible one of your helicopters could go again? They're like, sure.
They literally flew the helicopter out to New Orleans East, landed on a Reed Boulevard overpass, and a fireman put us in the boats and drove us over there. As we were flying from New Orleans East to the Superdome in this military helicopter is when we saw the entire city was underwater. I remember just sitting there and we just all had tears coming down our face because we were like, what the fuck?
I tried to go touch base with the East Bank Command, which they had settled at the Superdome.
And that in itself was not pleasant. It was chaos, complete chaos.
I mean, you knew it from walking up, but the amount of people that were on the outside versus the inside, there's no power, no infrastructure. You see toilets are starting to overturn. This is becoming a bad, bad scenario that's only going to get worse. And the conditions were there. So it was right for different things to happen, and our crews weren't in a good position.
The unsafest spot I've ever been in 25 years of my EMS career. So it was scary.
We were rescued from the dental school by Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. They actually came in via boat, piloted the boats into the lobby of the dental school, and we climbed into the boats from there.
It was total chaos.
And then eventually we got out by boat to the 610 overpass. Since it was the highest point, sick people were also showing up, and so we were taking care of people.
Me and a couple of guys, we made a landing gear on the opposite side of the 610, and a helicopter came and started removing the patients, not us.
From there, we had a military-type truck that the city had, or that was there, that was able to transport us downtown by the convention center area. It was like a meeting point to get out of there, because that was basically the only place that was not flooded in the city was downtown and some of the overpasses on the interstate. Everything else was just inundated with water.
So we ended up trading cigarettes for cots with the guardsmen that were out there. So we set up those cots outside the ambulances, and people were a little afraid. Well, Carl came in and was telling us that they were going to be evacuating the ICUs of VA, University, and Charity and bringing them over to us. They unloaded those ICUs, put them into boats, brought them to the Superdome ramp. Using military vehicles, they brought them over to the helipad, and we got those patients out via civilian medical aircraft.
There are thousands of people in the Superdome and are desperate. They have not had any food. They have not had any water. They have not had any electricity. The Superdome roof was leaking. So they put us in a very unsafe environment.
It was time to get out of the Superdome. Our job here was done. So we sent majority of people out, but Dr. Saucy was up there with us, and she asked for a number of volunteers to stay behind. And the rest of the crews went down to the Hampton Inn, where they knew or thought that the police were, and some other of our staff were sitting there waiting. In the middle of the night, we could hear a little bit of radio traffic. The crews that were at the Hampton Inn, they were afraid for their lives. They said that they had no transportation and that the water was coming up. Being that they were down there by Convention Center Boulevard, they started walking across the Crescent City connection. And that was the last we heard of them.
We were at a hotel there across from the convention center for less than a day. Once we got to the hotel, we were settling in, and word came through that the levees had broke and we had to evacuate because the water was coming. And with limited communications, we weren't sure of a time frame. So we made a choice that we had to get out of there. And the best thing to do was to head to the West Bank, because we heard the West Bank wasn't flooded. That's when we tried communicating, trying to get rides, and couldn't get through. There was some communications over the radio, but nobody was coming for us, so we had to start walking across the Crescent City connection.
It was difficult because we had a lot of employees who had a struggle or time walking and making that journey with their equipment. So it was challenging, and a lot of people were scared. I mean, there was no power, it was dark. You don't know who's out there, can't see nothing.
We didn't know what was going to happen next, but based on what we were hearing, we knew we had to get across the river. So we started walking. We were right by the HOV lane, and we just hoofed it. It was probably the singular most terrifying thing I've ever done. Completely pitch black. You could hear screams. You could hear gunshots. We didn't know if we were going to make it. And I remember I had an old school cell phone at the time, one of those little flip phones where you'd pull the antenna out. And nobody could make calls. And I wasn't sure if texts were getting through, but I ended up texting a really good friend of mine and just said, tell my family I love them, because I did not think I was going to get off that bridge.
You don't realize how steep the on-ramp to the Crescent City connection is until you start walking up it in the middle of the night after you have been without water and food for days.
We got about halfway up, and one of the firemen was coming across the bridge and saw us. He recognized a bunch of us, like, that's our people, that's our medics. What's going on? So we told them, and they're like, hold tight.
The cavalry arrived, and it was the New Orleans Fire Department.
NOFD had set up shop over at one of the nursing homes on the West Bank. And so he took a couple of us that were really bad off and really had medical problems and weren't doing well. And he said, I'm going to take them first and then come back, and we're going to have a bunch of trucks and cars. We're going to come back and get all of y'all. And, that's exactly what he did. So NOFD actually rescued New Orleans EMS that night, saved us.
Those guys wound up abandoning the Superdome themselves.
We heard that the people in the Superdome were threatening to riot. We heard of all this lawlessness that was going on inside the Superdome. We knew we had to get out of there, but the water was so high. There was no way anybody was going to drive in to see us, to rescue us. We were going to have to self-rescue ourselves.
They made their own way towards the river.
Waded through chest-deep water, and when we came out the other side, there was the post office. Ronnie pulls up next to us a couple of minutes later in a postal truck. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, yeah, well, we got our first bit of federal aid right here. He hot-wired that postal truck. Now, we gave it back to the post office. We told them we had it, but, that was way after the fact. We made it to the Triple C, and we saw some firemen up there. They told us that the nursing home down at the end of General de Gaulle was where our people were safe. They picked them up in the middle of the night. They saw them, they picked them up, they brought them down there to house them, and we followed them into the nursing home.
We get to the nursing home, and as per usual, the NOFDs got it set up. They gave us the chapel for our whole team. We lived there for a long time, or it felt like a long time. Actually, that became a wonderful place. NOFD made sure we were fed. We made sure they had medical care, and it was like we recreated a home.
It was just a big welcome feeling that when we got there, we were able to get a meal. We just started colonizing the nursing home.
At least you felt secure and safe, compared to what the rest of the city had.
I managed to find a really quiet meeting room in the nursing home that had a big, long table with a bunch of chairs around it. And I just remember climbing under the table and pulling the chairs in around me. I was like, nobody can get me if I'm under here. And I just tried to sleep. And I just remember feeling my heartbeat And it was so fast. But I kept thinking, at least it's still there.
When they got to the nursing home, we were probably the last group to come into that area because the other crews they didn't have any other place to stay. So that's where they went. And when we moved in, we had, I believe Chicago Fire was there, FDNY was there.
National Guard showed up, which was a big relief.
The city was still insane at that point in time. There was still people trying to get out of the city that couldn't.
We had to do something. We're not used to just sitting doing nothing. Before Katrina, we were busy. If you didn't do at least 12, 13 items in your shift, you're lazy. You weren't working. So to sit there for that long a time and not do anything, when the whole city is out there, police department, other agencies are out rescuing people, we're just sitting there. We couldn't do anything. Our job has never been to rescue people as EMS. It was to pick them up in ambulances, take them to the hospital. So we wanted to get out there and do stuff.
Dr. Saucy and Mark Rice, who was the deputy director at that time, made their way back down to the Superdome because that's where we had learned that the 82nd Airborne came in to assist us. General Honore said, take whatever medics you can, go to the convention center parking lot, and we're going to be sending you some help.
And I remember as we wrapped everything up, he's like, Saucy, you got it? And I said, yeah. And he looked at me, he goes, don't fuck this up. And I said, no, sir, I won't fuck this up.
We're now at the nursing home, and it's the next morning. Dr. Saucy gets us to gather around, and she said, look, I know it's scary over there, but they have some sick people, and the military is going to try to get them out somehow. We had no idea how. We heard of fights and the shootings on Convention Center Boulevard that were just not safe for us to go. But we filled up 3 ambulances worth of medics, and we went down there.
We didn't have any stretchers. We didn't have any equipment. We didn't have anything. So we had to use broken chairs, dollies, leftover shopping carts to move people.
We literally had just 2 trucks of equipment, but that was it. And so it was very MASH, crash medicine, identify who is sick, who is not sick.
And we walk off and we get on an asset and go down to figure out how we're going to evacuate 20,000 people from the convention center.
That was an amazing day. I think it was a Saturday, but it could be mistaken. And that's once everybody had been evacuated out of the Superdome, had been pushed to the convention center. And when we got out there that morning, there were thousands of people on the street. There were thousands of people inside the convention center. There were thousands of people in the parking lots overflowing.
When we looked up, there were like these helicopters, just lines and lines of helicopters, hover taxiing, waiting for a spot to land in the parking lot. That's when this guy in a green flight suit comes walking up to us. It happened to be one of the pilots that I flew with while I was in the National Guard. He's like, you remember how to land these helicopters? I said, yes, sir. He's like, I want 3 Hawks right here, 3 Hawks right here, 2 big helicopters on the 3rd lane. Chris Keller and Perry Lou actually helped us out with that. Chris Keller was a civilian helicopter pilot, so he knew his way around a helicopter. And Perry Lou was a combat veteran with the U.S. Navy. He was a Navy corpsman with the Marines.
I want to say it was one of the largest, if not the largest, civilian evacuation by helicopter ever. But we landed all day long. We were landing Black Hawks, we were landing Chinooks, we were landing the Super Stallions and putting, remember 53 went on the Super Stallion, and I believe it was like 47 went on the Chinook, and we could do like 12 on the Black Hawk unless it was a Coast Guard helicopter, then it was like 7, and we were trying to keep families together. It was really moving to see this mass of people all, trying to survive this event with all of their belongings in a plastic bag, from a grocery store. Everything that they could carry with them, they had with their kids and their family. And we did what we could to triage them, to make sure that they were okay to get onto the helicopter to travel and continue the evacuation.
That actually went on all day. We completely cleared Convention Center Boulevard after about, I want to say 18 to 19 hours. We cleared out 19,000 people. I mean, the military threw everything at this LZ, which actually became known as LZ Superman, because Mr. Derry's, his unit's call sign was Superman. So we named it LZ Superman.
We were told we airlifted out more people in that day than they airlifted out at the last day of Vietnam from there. It was like, when you think about it, that's a lot of people. We must have sent off thousands of people from that location.
I think about it to this day, just the sadness and sorrow of having to survive such an event, and the difficult circumstances it was in the days following for most of our civilian population, with limited food and water, no air conditioning, no relief from the heat. It was very hot and humid, for weeks after.
They had a lot of sick people that couldn't make it in on their own. And if it wasn't for us going out there, getting them and bringing them to the helipad, they might have not have left ever.
So that, that gave you a little sense of pride. We did something big. Us little New Orleans EMS, we did something big.
I'd love to tell you that there was any process to any of this. We set up an EOC, trying just to figure out what our next steps were. So at first it's survival, second it's safety, and then eventually it was, okay, what now? What next? We knew we were going to stay. We knew we were going to rebuild. There was no question in my mind about that. It was how, though, and where. And we spent the next 10 years in a FEMA trailer under the bridge, Calliope.
That was a tough time. You lose everything, and a lot of your workforce is abandoned, or, they just couldn't deal with it. People just worried about their loved ones, and just, it was a small force of employees that returned. A lot of neighborhoods didn't have people in them, weren't back still. You still have places today where it's not rebuilt. 20 years later, there's places you can go find buildings that are still vacant. Just a long recovery process. I think we're still recovering. So, realize the magnitude of it. It's mind-boggling when you think about it.
Initially, the level of devastation, just across the city, everywhere you looked, the norms of civil society, 80% of the city's underwater, tens of thousands of people were not able to evacuate. I did not think this city was going to come back. 20 years later, New Orleans is not the same city it was before Katrina.
I don't know if I ever thought it would recover. I don't, to this day, feel like we've recovered. I think we've just put a big Band-Aid over the city. It just hasn't been ripped off yet.
The devastation, the destroyed houses, the water. When I finally was able to see or get close to my neighborhood, it was underwater, and realizing that we packed for 3 days, clothing for 3 days, everything else was gone. There was nothing else left. And once that hit, that feeling hit, it was like, we're not going to ever be the same.
I think when it comes to disaster response, until you've really lived it, you don't understand the scope of the impacts it has, not just on the built environment, but on people, on coworkers, on social systems, healthcare systems. Once you've lived it, you just have a different perspective. I would never wish my experiences on anyone, ever.
I became the designated find my sister, find my mom person here in New Orleans. I would get phone calls, and of course I would find these people, relatives, friends, and wasn't easy, but it was just something. It got to the point where I can tell the difference between the smell of a dead body, a refrigerator that had been closed up for weeks.
It was devastation everywhere. Bodies in water, and we were tagging bodies, and the city was at its worst I've ever seen it.
I'd rather go back to war than to do Katrina again. It was that bad.
It's a personal battle that you have to just prepare yourself for. And how do you do that? I don't know.
I don't want to speak of religion on film, but I look to my religious belief and ask for strength to get through that. And I know I wasn't supposed to, but I kind of led that on to my crews. And whatever their belief was, just look to where your strength was. And that's how I got through it. And that's how I also kind of shattered that to my employees.
In tragedy, I like to say it allows us to either break or bond. And I think that became more of a bond for us.
Knowing that we'd been through the worst disaster, there was this sense of camaraderie, this renewed sense of, I guess, honor, drive. We just made it through one of the worst disasters ever, and we made it out together and alive, like Mark told us. We did have some people that left, but those of us that stayed were very much motivated to do whatever we could to make this service great again.
It was time to get back to work. There was work to be done, and I think you were just more passionate and filled to try and get things right. Everything was about the reinvigoration of New Orleans EMS, the rebirth, if you will.
We were already a family, but it brought us closer together. We were living together, eating together, working together. That brought us closer together and helped us. We had the support of each other.
Life was different back then, right? 20 years ago, just in general. We were a department that was very small, and still are, but we had very limited resources. We were doing MacGyver medicine. You would MacGyver things, you would figure stuff out. So we were used to doing without, to making things happen without the resources that we needed. And that is really what got us through. Just the camaraderie that we had, and the love and dependence on each other that we had got us through that.
The most amazing thing was the people were so happy to see EMS.
People started cheering. They recognized the patch on our shirts. We grew up in an EMS service that was called ambulance drivers, and they said, "No, that's our EMS." That was touching, because they recognized what we did. So, yeah.
In this moment of complete loss of humanity in a lot of ways, there was this absolutely beautiful response from people about, "She's sicker than I am. He needs you more. I'll wait." And so I was reminded that day and many days moving forward of just the beauty of humanity in the face of crisis.
Choked up with this. That sticks with me today, because when people ask, "Why did you stay?" It's that, right? People don't remember these dynamic things you do. They remember the personal contact. And so for me, at that very moment, this became very personal for me. And so every effort I had was to rebuild this to the best service it could be. And so that became the impetus for this whole service and where we were. But it was a good tale.
If it happened again, I'd stay again. Sounds crazy, but been through it, understand what's expected, understand the magnitude of it. And I may sound nuts, but the storm hit, I would stay here and rebuild.